Hello again, history. I got caught off talking about the position of the National Security Advisor, and I was just going to say that some of the other famous National Security Advisors in the late 80s, a man named Colin Powell served as the National Security Advisor, and then in the early 2000s for George Bush, Condoleezza Rice was the National Security Advisor. The gentleman currently, his name escapes me, but I hadn't really heard much of him. I probably don't follow the news well enough. But again, that position was held by Henry Kissinger and probably was one of the most noteworthy NSAs we've ever had. All right, moving on. We have, well, again, that date on that is May 4th in 1970, real early in Nixon's administration there. What provoked, from the text, the National Guard troops to fire on 4 students from their own country? It mentions students throwing rocks at soldiers, which in itself should not be excused either and definitely is inadvisable and violent behavior. But 4 students were dead. No evidence that any of the students who ended up dying because of this had any part in the violence toward soldiers or any disrespect at all. In fact, one of them was ROTC, so he was training to become a soldier himself. 9 were injured, including 1 was paralyzed. So a really dark day in our nation's history and a real wake-up call to what was going on. You know, really hard to believe this happened. If you remember back in 1965, I think, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was passed by Congress, giving the president basically the power to declare war if he ever saw fit without getting approval from Congress like he used to. The words on page 879 were that President Johnson had the power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States. I think I understand it as when we're being, when there's an aggressor, we don't have time to be going through the channels of approval. We just need to be deploying troops to take care of the matter. This gets overturned by what's called the War Powers Act 3 years later in 1973. So no longer the president had this authority to bypass Congress and just declare war. That would be now unconstitutional. POTUS, POTUS stands for President of the United States. Again, just like before, now again, he needs congressional approval. Remember that. Nixon's strategy, where he was kind of pulling back but also expanding under his madman theory, he becomes even less aggressive and starts to compromise more towards 72, 73 until finally the war will end. Monumental legislation instituted in 1971. What was it and what was its significance? What were the fears? 26th Amendment. It lowered the voting age. Previously it had been 21 down to 18. Significance now, younger people could vote. It's still that age today. And super appropriate because they were being sent and deployed and even drafted into fighting this war, but they couldn't even vote for who was calling the shots in our country, right? So I think that was a big part of what drove that decision. It is the 26th Amendment to our Constitution. The fear was there would be some kind of a youth revolt. Now that this new age group of 18, 19, 20-year-olds, these college-age kids, could now be voting whoever, into office. But there's still a minimum age to the president himself or herself. And I think some of that was just fear of the way things used to be, right? Important events in the final years of the war in order. What happens at the end of 1972 in the month of December? Then right away in 1973, January, and then 1974. April 1975, unfortunately, will also be tacked on. What's happening? The U.S. is bombing North Vietnam, and then in 1973, delegates meet, including Viet Cong delegates, South Vietnamese delegates, and of course the U.S. and the North Vietnamese, to sign a series of accords called the Paris Peace Accords, which would call a ceasefire and set up, okay, what do we agree on going forward? The North and the South Vietnam sections are broken, much like the the way Korean War was resolved. So there's a North and a South and a line of demarcation in between. That's what we end up having to agree on, whether we suspected this would happen or not. Not long after, maybe a year later, North Vietnam captures the capital, Saigon. They even rename it Ho Chi Minh City, sort of a slap in the face of the history. Although, if you still live in South Vietnam, every day you hear people calling it Saigon. To most people, it's probably the more familiar title. But if we were to watch episode 8 and 9 in the video, we learn about how the people who were part of the South Vietnamese government or supported that effort were very afraid and fled if they could in time, because they were victims of a lot of violence when North Vietnam ends up taking over. And now all of the country of Vietnam is controlled by the communist regime there. There's a picture of Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor we talked about, a political cartoon about their strategy called Vietnamization. We didn't watch episode 9, and we probably won't. It's titled A Disrespectful Loyalty. An interesting, what would be the word? Oxymoron. Sounds like opposites put together. But let's talk about a few words that are important to our study in Vietnam. Moratorium, again, Vietnamization. What is a PO, or who is a POW? What were the Pentagon Papers again? And let's review who's Henry Kissinger. President Nguyen Van Thieu. You've heard about him in previous videos as well. Paris Peace Accords, again, are the final peace terms to end the war. You see a picture of the U.S. delegates at that, and they're calling for a variety of things. We will remove all U.S. troops from both areas, North and South Vietnam. POWs means prisoners of war. There is one gentleman interviewed, interspersed throughout the Ken Burns documentary, where he's talking about they have to kill a cat to try to eat. They mistreat him. He has serious medical wounds. How hard it was to basically be out there with a small group of prisoners, with a brutal group of Viet Cong. He does actually finally get to return to the U.S., and it's a very emotional part of the video where they talk about the return of these POWs to the United States, looking malnourished, unrecognizable from when they were deployed, super thin. They had been mistreated as prisoners. They had to agree that the current president in South Vietnam, Thieu, could remain the president there, but you note in the book there needed to be communist delegates and a communist voice in the government in South Vietnam too. I think that's significant. There's the buffer, the DMZ, or demilitarized zone, much like in Korea, that would separate North and South. And secret promise from Nixon. We didn't get to hear about that in episode 9 because we didn't watch it. But let's move on to January 27th, 1973. A treaty included the governments of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which is North Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. This is really hard to keep those titles straight. Of course, the United States, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government, which we understood as the Viet Cong. That represented indigenous South Vietnamese revolutionaries. That's the names for all four grouped together at the circular table, deciding how would they go forward. A moratorium is a massive demonstration and teach-in across the United States against the United States involvement in the Vietnam War. That's what the moratorium to end the war in Vietnam was. We didn't get to watch as much about that, but there were mass demonstrations throughout the country ending and protesting the war and wanting to end it. Again, Vietnamization means we're withdrawing troops gradually, transferring responsibility and direction of the war to South Vietnam themselves. The prisoners of war were released, starting with the ones who had been there the longest under the Paris Peace Accords. Again, the Pentagon Papers were the secret documents that started to sow in the minds of Americans doubt in their political leaders, that maybe they lie to them in the interest of national security. Henry Kissinger, basically he's the diplomat, and he also becomes Secretary of State in the United States. He's under Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his Vietnam War Accords, 1973. Pictured here to the right is President Nguyen Van Thieu. He's president from 65 to 75, first a general in the army, then he became head of a military group, and then President, after winning a scheduled election, leads his nation through most of its war against North Vietnam. So he is actually the president we should remember for the majority of the war. We had the ones earlier on who were assassinated or scared out of office or not elected. But Nguyen Van Tu leads South Vietnam for a majority of their war until finally he has to turn it over to the communists. He felt abandoned by American politicians when the war is closed, and they just leave him there, for better or for worse. How did the Vietnam War affect Vietnam and the United States? Well, the death tolls noted in the book, 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong enemy soldiers are killed. 185,000 South Vietnamese soldiers are killed. 58,000 of our own, as well as 2,500 possibly dead. We don't know. They're missing to this day. 500,000 of civilians die. And again, these numbers are just estimates because accurate numbers were very difficult to come to. 1 million Vietnamese children are orphaned, often a quiet demographic of victims in their own right. Laos and Cambodia are turned over to communism, sort of giving credence to the whole domino theory that would happen. There's always the victim of the mind. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And when soldiers were brought back, sadly, many weren't welcomed back because of feelings toward the war in general. So if you ever meet a Vietnam War veteran, make sure you say welcome home and thank you for your service. They are struggling with the mental toll that they took on during such a difficult war that now they worry, was it worth it? Was it a corrupt war? Was it a waste of time? In the video, they use a word called fratricide. Especially Vietnamese would use that term. It means killing your brothers. Maybe it's a word we would use for civil war, where you're killing people of your own ethnic group. Similarities as you see them between Vietnam and the Middle East was sort of touched on at the beginning of this video and the big idea. So we're thinking, and on the test I'll probably ask you to type in some thoughts prepared on how do you feel about the U.S. involving itself in affairs in other governments overseas, communist or otherwise. In 1982, a memorial to this war and the veterans who bravely served in it was erected in Washington, D.C. A little-known fact, actual Asian Yale architecture student named Maya Ying Lin, who was only 21 years old, architectured that memorial. And it's made in granite, and in it we find all the dead or missing names of soldiers from the Vietnamese War. Thank you for listening. I know that went a little bit longer, but we're wrapping up a very important and long chapter on the Vietnamese War. Don't forget to take your Google quiz.